I'm pleased to stand today to speak to Bill C-10, an act to amend the Broadcasting Act at second reading. I am pleased that agreements were reached to allow us to have this time at second reading, and I want to thank the government representative, Senator Gold, and the bill's sponsor, Senator Dawson, for their strong support for sober second thought on this bill. We, senators, have work to do. Today, my comments are brief, and I will comment on both the substance and the process of C-10. One of government's most important roles is to respond appropriately to technological change. When it comes to television and radio broadcasting, for much of our history, entry into the system was guided by something called spectrum scarcity, where choices were limited by the technology of the day and where licenses were granted to companies by a regulator who set conditions, including Canadian content requirements, in return for the ability to reap advertising revenues. That was and is the business model of traditional broadcasting. Does anybody recall or have heard the phrase, a license to print money? That phrase was made famous not by the owner of a sports franchise, but by the owner of a television broadcasting license. And that person was a Canadian, Roy Thomson, Lord Thomson of Fleet, who famously described his new license to run a television network in Scotland as a license to print money. That was 1956. But those profitable enterprises of the past now see their revenues declining, especially with the rise of the internet and its vast array of unlimited choices available to Canadian consumers through streaming services and through social media. The government has positioned Bill C-10 as a response to this changing broadcasting landscape. And just as governments regulated the cable and satellite technologies of the past, which in their day also vastly increased consumer choices, so now government intends to regulate internet services. The model is there and the framework is there. The main goal of C-10 is simple: to apply the rules that are set for traditional broadcasters in Canada to online enterprises which provide broadcast services to Canadian consumers, such as Netflix, Amazon Prime, Spotify, and others. That will create a so-called level playing field, which is the government's key communication message of C-10. To use the more bureaucratic language, C-10 brings businesses that provide audio or audiovisual online content to Canadian consumers within the scope of the Broadcasting Act, such that they will adhere to regulatory obligations in a manner similar to conventional radio and television broadcasters. These so-called online undertakings will be subject to charges and expenditures and requirements to support and promote Canadian programming and Canadian creators. In addition, C-10 will require contributions for French language and Indigenous programming. And there is also mention of supporting opportunities led by women, LGBTQ plus communities, racialized and ethnocultural communities, those with disabilities, and other communities. Above all, the CRTC is charged with determining all of these requirements and how they will be carried out in a way that is flexible yet predictable, fair, information-based, equitable, and informed by consultation. The substance of C-10 has raised many important and high-level questions, including whether and how the internet should be regulated and whether this really is the best way to do that, whether Canadian consumers will be left with less choice after these changes are implemented, the future of Canadian content requirements and how they might change going forward, the future of Canadian ownership of broadcast companies, and whether any of this will assist traditional broadcasters to survive. And then there are a great many questions of how the requirements will be carried out, such as possible threshold levels needed for online undertakings to be included under the new regulations, how Canadian content can be made visible or discoverable on online platforms, including those with user content, whether the CRTC should have more direction from Parliament than C-10 now provides, and many other similar questions. There is much of substance for our Senate committee to examine. However, I want to talk briefly about the extraordinary process that has accompanied deliberations on C-10 in the other place, and how those events make our sober second thought even more important. The bill was introduced at first reading last November the 3rd in the other place. Pre-study of the subject matter began at the Standing Committee on Canadian Heritage on February the 1st, with 2 meetings and 17 witnesses. The committee then proceeded with 7 consecutive meetings on the substance of Bill C-10 after they received it formally on February the 19th. And following that, over 50 interested stakeholders provided feedback. The early committee meetings seemed to be proceeding quite smoothly, but proceedings went off the rails after clause-by-clause consideration got underway on April the 16th. On April the 23rd, Section 4.1 of the bill was removed by government members of the committee. This action effectively served to now include social media in the bill, which was contrary to early assurances that social media were not to be included in C-10. This change significantly altered the scope of the legislation and set off a firestorm of protest, with critics charging that the change opened the door to blanket regulation of user content on social media. The Minister and the Minister of Justice appeared at committee, an expert panel was convened, and a second charter statement was presented, but the controversy continued. This protest became very public, and in turn, it opened the door to opposition filibustering at committee, continuous filibustering by opposition members on the committee, until the government, with the support of the Bloc members on the committee itself, took the extraordinary step of time allocating the committee's work. According to media reports, this procedure, i.e. time allocation of committee work, had not been used in over 20 years. By the time the bill made it out of committee on June the 10th, they had met 30 times, twice in pre-study, 10 times to hear witnesses, and 18 times working at clause-by-clause consideration of the bill. Colleagues, I watched many of these meetings. Over the past 2 months, every Friday afternoon at 1 p.m., I fired up my computer and tuned into the committee. Parview became my favorite online streaming service, and the Heritage Committee deliberations on C-10 became my favorite television reality series with Canadian content. You never knew what was going to happen next. But the drama was not over even after the committee finished its work. When the bill went back to the House, the Speaker ruled that more than 20 of its amendments were out of order because they had been voted on after time allocation had ended. And then most of these amendments were subsequently reinserted into the legislation in the marathon session at third reading, which took place last Monday night, just 1 week ago today, and went on into Tuesday morning at 1:30 a.m. And then, colleagues, it came to us. Senators, 30 meetings and over 4 months at committee stage might be unheard of, but I stand here today that this legislation still needs further study. There are many good elements in this bill. It has serious goals, good framework, and many important elements. C-10 enjoys the support of stakeholders across Canada's arts and culture and broadcasting communities, including many people in the huge and substantial Toronto cultural community where I live. And this is very important to me. Organizations like the Writers Guild of Canada, the Alliance of Canadian Cinema, the Canadian Media Producers Association, the CBC, and many of Canada's major television broadcasters support the bill. But there are outstanding issues, which I mentioned earlier, and the process in the other place was fraught. Above all, colleagues, I feel that public confidence is lacking at this point in time. And I see a positive role for us in this chamber to play in this regard. I look forward to the Senate's study of this legislation. I strongly encourage colleagues to send this bill to committee so it can receive the sober second thought it so clearly needs. Thank you. Merci, miigwech.